Okay, thanks Ray, and I'd also like to thank the organisers for asking me to present here today. I suppose what I want to talk about is the factors driving efficiency in pasture-based systems. And when I kind of stood back from this talk, I said probably better also to put some context in this for the audience in relation to the Irish dairy industry, what's in the Irish dairy industry and what does it look like. Just in terms of land usage, we're generally pasture-based in Ireland. About 76% of the land is in relation to grassland. There is some rough grazing at 9%, some commonage at 8%. The rest is cereals and exports such as, the Guinness, that kind of food and drink exports. Just in relation to grass and grass growth, this was work that was done nearly over 20 years ago now, looking at the map of Ireland and looking at the potential for growth across the country in terms of the length of the grazing season and in terms of the total production. And essentially showed that there was quite a range in terms of production, but even in the very northern half of the country, we could still grow over 11 tonnes. Down in the south, we could grow about 15 tonnes, down the extreme south. Grazing season length or grass growth period up in the north was 240, 270 days, and down the further south it could be up to 330 days. So quite a diversity in terms of the length of the grazing period or the length of the growing period and the amount of grass that can be grown. They're important in terms of when we talk about our systems and our optimum systems. Just a couple of brief stats about the dairy industry. We were probably a little unlike the UK industry. We were very much constrained by quotas up to 2015. We're very much grass-based, seasonal calving. Mean calving date, about 90% of the herd calf in the spring, with a mean calving date of somewhere of the order of the 10th of March. And we have a seasonal profile. Based on that, we have a seasonal profile where we peak at somewhere around 14.5% in May, June. So that's what the profile looks like. On average, 24-hour periods, when we take periods in, periods out, we graze for about 250 days, 250 24-hour periods. There's probably 270, 280 days where cows have access to grass, but 24-hour periods is 250 days. And I suppose 80% of the milk is produced from grass. This slide is, the detail of this slide is not important. It's just to give you an idea of what how we manage our system. And our system is designed, I suppose, that we can synchronize feed demand for the dairy herd with feed supply. And essentially what we have here is we match calving to the profile of grass growth. So essentially demand and supply match as much as possible. That has implications in relation to the breeding of the herd when we calf the herd. So, we try to calf here with a mean calving date of the 10th of March. Then we breed very much in a block basis, and we dry off on a block basis. So it's just the point I'm trying to make from that slide is that it's very block focused, matching the supply and demand for feed. Don't worry about the detail in this slide. Just want to draw attention to the bottom where we talk about cost of production. And essentially, when we look at cost of production over a time horizon, in 1994, our average cost of production in cent per litre were about 17.26 cent per litre. When we look up to 2015, it was 23.8. The point I'd just like to make is that if we look at where we were in 2013, our average cost of production were 27.4, and there has been significant strides made in taking down cost of production at farm level. It's happening from two reasons. Mainly driven by an increase in output at farm level, and that increase in cost here in 2013 was essentially costs that were built up in the herd as a result of guys planning for expansion post-quota. So just the point here, our cost of production have dramatically dropped in the last 2 years. The focus we have at farm level is to keep those costs where they are, if not drop further. And we know that if we try to continue, if we try to, I suppose, expand further by bringing in extra feed, that's not what's going to happen. So our focus is very much on grass utilisation and expansion through grass utilisation. Just in terms of milk price volatility, we're probably similar enough to the UK industry in terms of price. Just to draw your attention to 2006-07, very little volatility pre-2006-07, and this is what we're looking at now. So it's very hard if we apply the same principles as we applied post milk price volatility at farm level, we're not going to be able to survive it. So we have to change our ethos and change how we farm completely to manage it. And some of it is about how the system we manage, but some of it is also using tools and tools that are available to manage volatility. Just in terms of dairy cow numbers and what's happened and around the expansion story around in the dairy industry in Ireland, we had roughly about 1 million cows, just over 1 million cows in 2005. When the signal came that quotas were going to be removed, farmers started to plan for expansion. We have approximately 1.25 million cows now. So we've increased by ballpark 200,000 cows in the last 10 years. The vast majority of this increase is starting to come now with quotas gone off the scene, and that's been driven by farmers generating extra replacement heifers on the ground and those heifers entering the herd. So that's how those numbers are increasing. Just in terms of milk output, again the detail is not important here, but just to make the point that in terms of milk output, we look at it in terms of output of kilos of milk solid. Not really volume. We don't really talk about volume anymore. We're commodity based. We sell kilos of protein and kilos of fat. So our focus is on increasing solids output from the herd. Just in terms of 2005, we were producing approximately 4.9 billion litres of milk at 3.3% protein, 3.77% fat. So about 355,000 tonnes or 358,000 tonnes of milk solids. In 2015, milk output now is 6.5 billion litres. Milk protein percent nationally was 3.5%. Milk fat 4% or just over 4%. And tonnes of output now are 507. So just to put that in context, milk output, even in the context of quota and being constrained by quota, between 2005 and 2015 has increased by 42% in terms of milk solids output. Our food harvest target, it's a government policy plan to increase milk output by 50% by 2020, was to increase it by 50%. By the end of 15, we'll have an increase of 39% of that reference food harvest target. The other important point to make here is that as an industry, there's been a lot of talk about, increasing output by 50% and what's that going to do to European markets and global markets. We produce 5.5, 6 billion litres of milk. The UK industry, I think, produces up to 14.5, 15 billion. We're relatively small. We produce 0.7, 0.8% of global milk production or 3.5% of European milk production. So if the Irish industry increases by 50% or 70% or 100%, we're not really big players in the overall scheme of things. So we're not going to have a huge effect on the global market. So just in terms of the drivers of efficiency, that was kind of a little bit of context to the Irish dairy industry. So I suppose to break down the drivers of efficiency and profitability in the industry, we break it into two things. First one is in relation to grass utilisation, and the second one is in terms of fertility. The rest, other things have implication in terms of profitability, but they're relatively small. So if our dairy farmers have a high grass utilisation, and if they have a good 6-week calving rate, they're going to be in the top 5%. The rest we don't really worry about. The other small stuff we don't really worry about. For example, we don't really worry about milk yield per cow. We have Irish studies showing there's no relationship between milk yield per cow and profit. There's Dairy Co studies showing no relationship between milk yield per cow and profit. So it's not a metric that we talk about to our farmers. So just in terms of grass utilisation, and the first thing to say is that this is a National Farm Survey data set. Our National Farm Survey is our national FADN network data set. So it's a representative data set. It's not self-selecting. It's a data set that's very robust in terms of efficiency, in terms of the farmers that are entering and leaving the data set on an annual basis. This slide just shows the effect of grass utilisation per hectare and gross margin per hectare. And we can see that there's a huge relationship between net margin or gross margin per hectare and grass utilisation based on 2013 data. So for every extra tonne of grass utilised, we increased our profit by €339 in gross margin terms. In terms of net margin, which is probably even more important, we can see that in 2013 we could explain 43% of the variation in net margin per hectare by grass utilised per hectare. And for every extra tonne of grass that we utilised, it was worth €232 per hectare. Just in terms of total costs, and this one is kind of self-explanatory, as total costs on a cent per litre increased, net margin per hectare declined. So for every 1 cent increase in total cost on a cent per litre basis, our net margin per hectare declined by 140 euros. So costs and cost per litre have a huge influence on net margin and the returns to the farm. This is the final one in terms of the relationships, and basically what it showed here is that when we bring in more purchase feed into the diet, so as the proportion of purchase feed increases in the diet, essentially our variable costs are increasing. So basically for every 10% increase in purchase feed that's bought onto the farm, our variable costs increase by about 2.2 cents per litre. So as the proportion of purchase feed increases, our variable costs increase by 2.2 cents a litre. So that was all based on 2013. Just to summarise that, and because we I suppose didn't want to look at our analysis over 1 year, we brought a data set together that had the exact same data, but over between 2008 and 2014. So a much wider and larger data set. And essentially what we're showing here, that essentially every extra tonne of grass utilised is worth about 184 euros per tonne. So every extra tonne over a 6-7 year period, every extra tonne is worth 184 euros. Every extra day we can spend at grazing is worth 2.92 euros. So every extra day is worth 2.92 euros per cow. And as we increase the proportion of bought in feed, we're reducing our net margin per hectare by 105 euros per hectare for every 10% increase in bought in feed. Just to put this in context, nationally, we estimate that we're utilising about 8 tonne of dry matter per hectare. So we're utilising 8 tonne. Our best farmers, our top farmers, are utilising approximately 12.5, 13 tonne. So there's a difference there of 4.5, 5 tonne. So if we could increase our utilisation by 4 tonne across the industry, it would be worth somewhere of the order of 800 million euros per year to the dairy industry. So there's huge gains to be got at farm level, even from increasing utilisation. This is another study that was done with a similar data set, the Profit Monitor, and essentially what it shows here is the relationship between purchase feed per cow and profit. And essentially what we can show here is that on the top axis here you have proportion or kilos of concentrate fed or tons of concentrate fed per cow. So there was 4 categories: 250 kilos per cow, 700 kilos per cow, 1.1 tonne per cow, and 1.7 tonne per cow. What we can see directly is that as proportion of feed, or as the tons of concentrate or feed per cow increased, grass utilised declined. We can see that, before we even go on to that, we can see that milk solids went up. So milk solids yield went up. As we brought in more feed, cows produced more milk. But total cost went up disproportionately, and we can see that profit on a per hectare basis reduced from 1,300 euros down to 1,100. So these farmers that bought in the extra feed produced more milk per cow, but actually reduced profit per hectare. So that was based on a Profit Monitor, another independent data set with a slightly larger sample of maybe 1,300 farms. And again, this was over a 4 to 5 year period. The final data set I'll show to prove the same point, essentially, is a study that we've done on our research farms. So this is a research farm that was up in the northern half of the country, up in Cavan. And essentially what we looked at here was a high grass system or a high input system. The high grass system, we'll say, on a 40 hectare farm had 124 cows. The high input system had 180. Stocking rate 3.1 versus 4.5. The rest you don't need to worry about the detail. What we did was we compared 3 options. We compared option 1, where you had 40 hectares and 124 cows. Option 2, high input, bringing in a lot more supplement, 40 hectares and 180 cows. And option 3, where you could bring in extra land. So the land was available to bring in. So we still went to 180 cows, but we kept our stocking rate down to 3.1. So there are the options. Expand by bringing in extra feed, or expand by bringing in extra area. And we put a cost in for the extra area. And essentially what I suppose, the diet was different in the 2 scenarios. In one scenario you had about 3.5 tonnes of grass in the diet, and the other one you had 2.6. And I suppose just in terms of what the numbers look like, what we can see here is that at a milk price of 24 cents a litre, the high grass system and the high grass where we brought in the extra land were almost identical, but the high input system was generating about 30,000 euros on a 40 hectare farm less profit. Where we go to a milk price of 29 cents a litre, we can see here that the high grass system, where we bring in extra land, is the most profitable, generating somewhere around 35,000 euros profit, versus the high input system at somewhere around 10. and the base scenario about 23,000. And finally, where we look at a milk price of 34 cent a litre, the same story applies. The principle here, and the point I just want to get across, expansion through bringing in extra land, even though you're paying for all that extra land, is much more profitable than bringing in extra supplementary feed. And just to make that point clear, and this one will shock people, rather than go to the high input system, the guys could pay up to €1,900 a hectare to rent the land rather than go to the high input system. Now, that's not to say that we want them to pay that kind of money to rent the land, but just to make the point that rather than change the system, they could pay huge money rather than change the system. So that was kind of 3 different studies kind of telling you the same story, essentially. A little bit of overkill, but try to get the message. In terms of fertility, is the next key one. And this one is a lot shorter in terms of the different areas I'm looking at. I suppose there's a number of different areas where infertility or fertility hits you at farm level. First one is in terms of increased calving interval. And remember how important the synchrony of feed supply and feed demand is for us in terms of our system, our grass-based system. It's also important in terms of high-input TMR systems as well, because you're losing days open is a significant cost. So increasing calving interval has an effect on the calving date of the herd, but it also has an effect at processor level in terms of the processing efficiency, in terms of product portfolio, in terms of processing cost. There's also, in terms of infertility, there's increased replacement cost, there's increased AI and intervention costs, and there's increased labour. Essentially, we would say that a herd with good fertility, well managed, could probably one person, maybe potentially in a grass-based system, might be able to manage 120 or 130 cows, whereas if you're, a system with poor fertility, that might be down to 70 to 80 cows in terms of what one person could handle. So what we'd like to do is pull all that together to develop one singular indicator trait for fertility, which we use and we call 6-week calving rate. Again, the detail here is not very important, just to make the point that for every 1 day slippage in calving date beyond the optimum, it costs about €3.86. So if a herd has a mean calving date of the 1st of April because of poor fertility rather than the 15th of February, that cost is 50 days by €3.86, could be of the order of €190 in that herd for that year. In terms of replacement rate, higher replacement rate results in lower milk yields. First lactation animals produce about 75% of a mature cow, and a second lactation 92%. So herds that have poor fertility essentially do not realise that potential at all, because in terms of what the milk production potential is, because they have a lower age profile within the herd. So again, detail here not important, just to make the point that every 1% reduction in replacement rate is worth about €13.90, which we've calculated. So it's worth about €13.90. So it's a huge implication in terms of the effect of replacement rate on profitability. So then we wanted to combine all that information together into one singular trait that's associated with infertility, and we call that 6-week calving rate. It's a key driver of our system. And essentially what we look at, it's defined as the percentage of cows that calf in the first 6 weeks of the calving season. So the percentage of cows that calf in the first 6 weeks. Nationally, currently at the moment, it's 58% in Ireland. And our target is 90% in good herds. Our target is 90, and essentially we have about 5% of our herds are at that 85% and heading up towards 90. So it's pretty stressful, and I suppose there's a lot of work when calving happens, but it's all over after a very short period of time. It means that you have one set of calves, it means you have one set of breeding, and it makes things very simple in terms of what you're trying to achieve. So just in terms of the 6-week calving rate, it's the total percentage of cows that calf in the 6-week period. For a cow, we estimated at about €9.29. For a heifer, at €3.54. For a herd, we estimate every 1% change in 6-week calving rate. So every 1% change in 6-week calving rate is worth €8.26. So just to scale that up nationally we're at 58%. If we were to achieve our target of 90%, it's worth about €264 per cow, or €26,500 on 100 cow herd. Again, to scale it up to a national overall industry level, it would probably be worth somewhere in the order of about 350 million euros per year if we do achieve that 90%. So, for the overall industry to get to that 90%, it'll probably be a little bit difficult, but I suppose the point here is that every move we make towards it, there's a significant gain. The final, just a couple of slides on competitiveness, and this is just, I put this in because it's a piece of work that we've just recently completed. We use the IFCN, which is the same as what's used within this group in terms of IFCN comparison, and it uses a typical farm, not an average farm. It just uses a typical farm within the industry, and it's defined. It's slightly different to other methodologies, but it's a defined farm. So what we did was we just compared Ireland, UK, US, New Zealand and Australia. Just pulled them together and just compared them in terms of what the differences were in a cost of production and in terms of cost of percentage of output. This just shows a graph of the different, the different costs of production within the different countries within the IFCN. The real point here is in relation to cost of percentage of output, and this is 2004 data. Again, relatively good milk price in 2004, or a pretty good milk price. Ireland was somewhere in the order of 60% cost of percentage of output, so the cost, that meant there was a margin of 40%. And I suppose just to highlight, UK in this scenario was somewhere around 82, 83%. What we've done, because the IFCN is a little bit behind, we then factored in what the potential looked like based on indices is what the whole thing might look like a little bit from 2015. And essentially what it shows us, of the order of somewhere around 70, 75, 80% in terms of what our numbers look like, and just in terms of UK, somewhere around the 100% for that herd, and somewhere around 90% for that herd. Just to make the point that, as milk price dropped, and it dropped right across the world. Some countries compared a little bit more favourable to others. So just in terms of conclusion, milk price volatility requires a focus on cost control. So milk price volatility is something that we're going to have to deal with. It's here. But at farm level, the power of being able to control costs ensures that volatility has less of an effect on the system. It's always going to have an effect. For us, grazed grass provides that cost advantage. So it allows us to produce milk at a lower cost that allows us to deal with volatility. For us, focus on two key aspects. Keep it simple. Grass utilization and dairy cow expansion, or dairy cow fertility, will allow expansion to happen while keeping control of costs. As we bring in more feed, and it's a big concern for us with quotas gone, as we bring in more feed, there is potential for that profitability to reduce. And it's something that we have to watch for on a continuous basis. And I suppose just to say that internationally, grass-based systems do provide a cost advantage. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurence, for that powerful presentation. We're now able to take some questions. Phil.
Hi, really interesting presentation. You say grass utilisation is one of the key factors you look at. Is that simply stocking rate and some sort of grass growth model, or are you actually looking at utilisation of grass within a farm? Because you can supplement grass and you can get better utilisation of that grass on the farm, or are you just saying, stocking rate?
So a very good question. So the way the utilisation is calculated here, it's a back calculation based on energy, based on the supply and demand, we'll say based on stocking rate, based on milk production, and based on the supplementary feed being brought in. In terms of your question about at farm level, can you have, high utilisation and supplementary feed? And in theory, yes you can. Absolutely yes you can. And very, very good farmers can do that. But what we know globally is that in reality that's not what happens. Farmers bring in supplement when milk price is high. They lose the discipline around grazing, and at that point the system starts to slip and they can't get that discipline back when milk price drops again. What an interesting, it's kind of it's a tongue-in-cheek type statement, but it's not probably far off the mark. It takes 1 year to get over a bad milk price year. It takes 4 years to get over a good milk price year. And it's probably not far off the mark,
Carolina, you've got a question?
It's partly answered, but also obviously I've done benchmarking in the UK, and one of the biggest problems was to calculate grass utilization with the data available. But I'll pick that up with you perhaps and break. Won't bore everyone else. But I wanted to ask about the purchase feed. When I looked at analysing the data on the UK, what I found was when we looked, obviously you looked at the proportion of purchase feed in the total dry matter intake. If we look at the purchase feed cost, what we saw as the purchase feed cost increased, your variable cost, or rather total cost, increased more than the equivalent, indicating increases in the associated cost.
Yeah. So we've a paper just published in Journal of Dairy Science showing exactly that. So for every 1 cent that's increased in terms of feed cost, there's a total cost increase of 1.7. So
Very similar to our data.
yeah.
Would that still be the case if wheat was £60 a tonne and soya was £150 a tonne?
Yes, because the associated... So in terms of the economics of bringing in supplementary feed, obviously it'll become a lot more attractive if feed prices is down. But you're still going to have the associated costs in the system. And like long term, do we see that, if we look at it into the future, do we see that as something that we can build our system around? Probably not.
Ray, if I may, this question is perhaps for Laurence and for Mark. In this country, we are obsessed with measuring everything by pence per litre. So the question is that obsession the right obsession to have? And that links with Tony's question earlier about terminology and the vocabulary we use.
Yeah.
So should we be thinking more, Laurence and Mark, about per hectare or per cow? Are we actually using the right measures at all?
So for me, and for where we were up to the 1st of April, on a cents per litre basis was the only way to do it, because that's what we were limited on. Quota was our limitation. So how you define your system, for me, should be built around what your most limiting resource is. So for us, it's going to be land, and it's going to be land around a milking platform, so per hectare. We can bring in loads of cows. Cows is not an issue, so it should never be about cows for us. Cows are, we can bring them in, we can up them or down them, there's no real issue. So for us, it should either be land or labour, because that's probably our next biggest constraint, is getting well-trained, enthusiastic young people into the operation that can drive it on. So it's either one or the other. At the moment, it's land, but in time, it could become people.
Yeah, and I sort of reflect some of that sentiment as well. The figures that we publish, we do publish on a per hectare basis as well. So we can take that measure depending on how you want to look at your business and how you want to sort of make your decisions. So we've got the pence per litre, obviously, because that's the most common method that most people tend to refer to. The other method, which is used more internationally, is obviously look at kilos of solids. And I think maybe that's a way we might be moving as well in terms of looking at costs on that basis.
David and then Tony.
Excellent though your presentation is, obviously it applies to Ireland largely. I just wonder how much, quite a bit of what you say applies to a lot of the UK, Although grass utilisation is obviously important, you're predominantly spring calved, you're producing all that milk there. I wonder if we shouldn't be fighting it in the UK, should we? We're not going to be able to compete with Ireland. You can graze them for 10 or 11 months of the year. Perhaps we should be concentrating more on summer and autumn calving, doing the opposite of what you've just said, and then taking cheap milk in the spring from cows in the last 2 or 3 months of lactation. I mean, it will vary within the UK, but I just think there's a bit of a danger of us jumping to doing what you're doing?
Just maybe 2 points. Just 2 points to say on that. First thing is, when I stand back and look at the map and look at the globe, we're not a million miles away from each other in terms of potential for grass growth. I think we potentially maybe overplay how much grass we can get into our system, but I think in the UK, and based on the discussions that have been here yesterday and today, I think there probably isn't enough focus on how much grass can be in the system here in the UK. So that's my take. And the other point is, and I think it's vitally important, is milk pricing and how milk price is managed. So we operate a commodity A plus B minus C multiple component pricing system. It's been in place with approximately 10 years. And if we look at the change in the rate of gain in terms of protein and fat concentration, it's almost doubled since we increased our pricing mechanisms. And I'm sure Mike and the geneticists we have in Ireland, who are always behind the bushel, never up front in terms of taking credit for things, will take credit for that. But I think pricing mechanisms have a huge influence. And I think, based on some of the work that we've done with Dairy Co, there is a lot of confusion. There's a lot of differences in terms of the pricing systems that means that farmers don't get a clear strategy on their direction.
Meanwhile, down on the farm, I'm absolutely delighted to be trying to practice what you preach, because it does make a huge difference down on the farm. I farm just down the road and just up the road in a low rainfall area. And if I can get anywhere near into double figures for utilisation, it would be fantastic. But we do have to relate to the marketplace, all right? And we are unique in the UK because we've got 66 million punters on our doorstep. We've just got to find a lower way of getting that product, a lower price way of getting that product to them, and then we'll see you buggers off.
I think this is a good point to exit.
Yes. Stage left.
Stage left.
Yeah.